This summer of 2020, a very small but interesting thing happened. The French parliamentary election. To many, it may seem like an insignificant event on a global scale, especially compared to all the war, all the climate catastrophes, the housing crisis, and the massive inflation is happening right now. However, still, it intrigued me a lot. So why did it intrigue me? Mainly for two reasons. The first is kind of positive one. We have a historical coalition between the French left. This is not only a thing that didn't happen for a long time, but also proven to be very successful, taking away the majority from the centrist neoliberal Macron party. And at this point, we kind of entered the second part of it, and the sad one. The Macron party, in response to the loss of the majority in the parliament, decided to align themselves with the far-right French party, not in a coalition, just on certain economical policies, for now, in order to counter the new left coalition power, and to be able to pass legislation in the parliament with the majority. This in itself is sad, but the reality is that a very common thing for history and could lead to a very sad situation. Being the main question, of course, why do liberal parties in times of crisis always choose to align themselves with fascist parties? Why is it a trend? While writing this video, another two very intriguing things happened: the Swedish and the Italian elections. In Italy, the far right-wing candidate, which is an open admirer of Mussolini, became the prime minister, while in Sweden, the far-right party also achieved a major victory in its history. Till now, the right-wing parties were present, but didn't have enough power in Europe, except in ex-Soviet bloc countries, where the majority of those countries are now controlled by right-wing nationalistic governments, mainly due to immense investment from Europe and USA to push those countries into nationalism as a counter to communist movement. But apparently, things are changing, and we are tasting our own medicine. The nationalistic parties are rising across Europe as mushrooms after rain, being my main fear that they will grow even stronger than they did in the 20s of the last century. As you may have realized by now, this video is going to be about why and how fascism and capitalism are connected. To better understand this, we need to go back, a little back, and understand a few historical and sociological facts. Despite common misconception, nationalism is a relatively recent phenomenon. To understand it a bit better, we need to go back to the 18th century, when nationalism was first born. Before that, there were no such thing as nation or national consensus. In the majority of countries around Europe, in every kingdom, there were multiple ethnicities, where almost every county spoke its own language, practiced its own festivities, and on many occasions even had different sets of laws, while being part of the same kingdom. As you might assume, this big difference between people of the same country resulted in the lack of national identity. But as feudalism slowly died, and with him the common symbols that vaguely united people in the same kingdom, a new way of uniting people under the same banner was invented. A stronger one, a better one, a bourgeoisie one. Of course, I'm talking about nationalism. Modern nationalism was invented in the 18th century by the bourgeoisie thinkers for the bourgeoisie society and implemented by the bourgeoisie government. The idea of what is nationalism is kind of familiar to everyone, so I'm not gonna waste time explaining what it is. I'll proceed to explain how it was implemented as a general ideology and how it benefits the capitalist bourgeoisie movement. The nationalistic ideas, like many other historical ideologies, had their roots in the past and have been forming themselves for centuries inside the bourgeoisie communities around Europe. Still, it was implemented slowly and took its time. That's why the fundamental ideology was mainly developed in the 18th century, but we only start seeing its full impact in the beginning of the 19th century. The best example to understand how nationalism was implemented is the post-revolutionary France and its bourgeoisie government. One of the most important measures was the creation of mandatory schools. And before going on forward, I just want to let it be clear that despite its many faults, I'm not against government-funded schools. On the contrary, I think it's great, despite its being used as an instrument of power for more than 200 years. In the context of this video, I talk about schools in the same paradigm as a workplace, prisons, army, etc. A place where you are told how to address, how to behave, where to go, how to speak, and basically to reproduce ideology. So, let's continue. By creating public schools, the government implemented the official language that every French learned, which made the French speak French. The reality is that before the revolution, every French region spoke its own language. Now, the entire population is united in the same language. At the same time, nationalistic symbols start being used in schools and all the rest of society, like flags, hymns, national heroes, etc. And the schools served as instruments of historical justification of the nations. Long forgotten heroes, songs, and tales were brought back, but this time with a nationalistic face. This was firstly implemented in France, and then spread to the rest of Europe, mainly through Napoleon's conquest. The turning point was when capitalism proved itself superior to feudalism. So now, the logical question would be, how does nationalistic ideas favor the bourgeoisie capitalist class? So, not only the nationalistic idea promotes the bourgeoisie culture into the masses, creating a cultural hegemony by imposing bourgeoisie values on the majority of the population, and thus granting their dominance, but mainly it benefits them economically, being the nationalistic state an important key in this. First of all, in nationalism, it is denied the existence of class conflict. In nationalism, there is no working class or bourgeoisie, there's only the nation, and we are all part of the nation. If there's a problem, it belongs to the realm of the individual, and it's never systematic. We should ignore the exploitation of one by others if it benefits the nation. The individual and the nation are the same. The wealth exists in a symbiosis relationship where one cannot exist without the other. And if your life is getting worse by every day, it's not because you're being exploited, it's because of some external enemy that is doing everything to worsen your life and to destroy your nation. So in this scenario, it's not because of greedy capitalists that you are suffering, it's because of some external enemy. Because in reality, nation is nothing but an empty name, a bunch of symbols that should mean nothing to us, or at least should mean less than a human life. If the day comes when some man asks you to go fight for your nation, remember that by nation he means an abstract territory that is occupied by a few monopolies that control all the resources and the narrative in your country. It's not your duty to defend the imperialist ambitions or the bourgeoisie government and the financiers. Your duty is towards your community, towards your loved ones, and towards human life. But to better understand this, let's take a look at the two of the most famous examples of nationalism. Germany and Italy of the last century are the most famous example of nationalism worldwide, mainly because they were European, because in reality, there are many other examples of bloody nationalism, like Chile Pinochet or Japan during the Second World War. But let's get back to Italy and Germany. Many times we talk about them and how those regimes came to power, but not very often we talk about the economical part of those fascist regimes and how that is connected to capitalism. After World War I and the win of the socialist revolution in USSR and other parts of the globe, socialist ideas were stronger than ever, with revolutions and revolutionary sentiment all across the West. In case of Germany, we even had a failed attempt at revolution, which I discovered recently in more details, mainly due to Jonas Seka and his incredible video on the matter. I'll leave the link in the description. But let's get back to our protagonists. The Western imperialists and capitalists start being afraid of this new red wave. Not only being afraid, but also severely disliking the serious losses that they suffered due to massive and continuous strikes. In response to this, many of them, in Italy and Germany, started founding different nationalistic paramilitary groups, with the purpose of dismantling the strikes and entering in direct confrontation with the workers. At the same time, they were founding and continuously financing different nationalistic groups in both countries, which turned out to be a success, first in Italy and then in Germany. The fascists, through massive propaganda that was basically fully financed by the capitalists, took power. As soon as these movements start showing the first sign of success, all the Western capitalists start seeing good benefits of investing in them, especially after the small victories achieved by the workers in the early 20s, like the 8-hour workday, which constituted a very big problem for the capitalists, but at least now they had a way to deal with it. Just a small example. By the late 1930s, Brown Brothers Hermann, which claimed to be the world's largest private bank, in the UBC had bought and shipped millions of dollars of gold, fuel, steel, coal, and US Treasury bonds to Germany, both feeding and financing Hitler's build-up to war. And this is just one example. The list of sympathizers of this kind of regimes went from people like Henry Ford to British royal families. And of course, it's not very difficult to see why. It's very important to notice that capitalists didn't exclusively pump money into the Nazi party, but into any social movement that fought back against the workers and the unions. Just in the first years of this new government's rise to power, in Germany and Italy, the union strikes were outlawed, the majority of union leaders were sent to prison. Communist and socialist ideology books were banned and ideologues put in prison, like the famous Antonio Gramsci or the members of the Frankfurt School, who ended up fleeing to America. Minimum wage laws and extra time pay, a very recent victory for the unions, were also abolished. Workplace safety regulation requires were also severely cut. The average working wage dropped by 35% in Germany and by 50% in Italy. All this was accompanied by a big cut in taxation for the benefits of industrialists and big capitalists. The inheritance tax for the wealthy were almost completely abolished. All of this while simultaneously enforcing the biggest process of privatization ever seen. The result of all of these actions and many others was that even despite the Great Depression and the world's massive economic crisis that affected all capitalist countries, at the time when all the major capitalists around the world were suffering from a big slowdown in the growth, the German and the Italians one managed to counter this trend and get even richer, while at the same time the general population of those countries experienced a severe decrease in their living standards. Seeing this, the other Western capitalists that previously only financed their rise to power now wanted a similar kind of regimes in their own countries. Basically, an authoritarian state that suppressed the working class as much as possible, while at the same time highly benefiting the industrialist and capitalist class. For that, they even started very heavily promoting Mussolini and Hitler in their own countries, via promoting them in the media, which was owned by them. The majority of Western media started praising those personalities and the achievements of their regimes to the mass population. It was on this wave that we have such gems as Hitler, Man of the Year by Forbes magazine, being this only the most memorable example, of course. All of this with the purpose of persuading the population to agree with an implementation of similar regimes in their own countries. Today, we have thought that those German companies worked and survived despite the system, and didn't have any responsibility for what happened. This is a total lie. They were part of the system and they were responsible for creating it while benefiting a lot from those systems. In both of these countries, the liberals had a chance to stop the rise of fascism, but they choose not to. They choose not to align themselves with the workers, but instead align themselves with the fascists, mainly due to the fact that both had the same financiers, and both had much more in common than you might think, especially in Germany, where they betrayed the workers multiple times, like during the Kuno protests, where 3.5 million German workers went on strike, completely paralyzing the country due to severe attacks on all the rights won by them in the 1918 revolution. Despite gaining a small defensive victory, in the end, they were once again betrayed by the liberal government. But why does this happen? Why do liberals align themselves with fascists during times of crisis? One of the easiest ways to understand this is by looking at the political compass. This is the most typical political explanation for the political spectrum. But what if I told you this is a complete lie? They try to convince you that communism and fascism are part of the same line, that they are both extremes, and that we need to stay away in the center in order to avoid catastrophes. But this is bullshit. Not only making this kind of graph is silly, but also is technically incorrect. A more accurate line will have looked something like this. Liberalism and liberals are the true opposites of fascism, being the neoliberals in the middle. This is due to the fact that all those ideologies operate under the same economic system, capitalism. All of them result from it and depend on it for their existence. They will not make sense under other financial system. The main benefactor of this lie being, of course, the neoliberals. For the same reason, it doesn't make sense to put communism, socialism, and other similar ideologies in the same compass, mainly because they operate under completely different production and economical system, which just makes it silly to put them under the same roof. Just think about this on this way. If any of our Western governments wanted to implement a fascist state tomorrow, they could, mainly because the structure of production and social institutions are very similar between fascism and our liberal democracies, which cannot be said about implementing socialism, because they are not opposites in the same spectrum, they operate in completely different spectrums. That's why liberals will always choose to align themselves with fascists rather than the Reds, mainly because they operate in a similar spectrum. As they say, cut a liberal and a fascist will bleed. In a capitalist society, profit stands above all, and capitalists will go to any length to secure them, as they always did and will continue to do. We, as a Western society, will do everything to ensure that capitalism prevails, even under fascism, because it's easier for us to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Most prominent example of this was Operation Gladio, or other different operations that took place in Europe after World War, which basically consisted of US and Britain funding and helping underground groups and open militia with the objective of disrupting and neutralizing all communist movements across Europe and Asia. As a part of the same operations, the US preserved a lot of fascist members and structures in Italy, which at the end of the Second World War had a majority socialist government, just like France, in order to prevent a communist revolution in the country. If you want to learn more about how post-war anti-communist action was held, I highly recommend starting with a book called Jakarta Method, which basically tells the story about how Western anti-communist crusade shaped the world that we live today. In the same capacity, I could bring other numerous examples, like the coup in Chile, where US substituted the democratically elected socialist president for a fascist dictator, because despite him being fascist, he allowed the American companies to own and exploit the majority of resources in that country, or the Western funding of the Islamic terrorist group in the Middle East that fought against the socialist government in the region at the time, and allowed them to continue the exploitation of those countries and their resources by the American capitalists, or the support of openly nationalistic, a lot of fascist tendencies, ex-Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe. The list could go on, and the reality is that every time the profits are put in danger, the capitalists just do a coup and establish fascism, a government that will allow them to continue the exploitation of those countries. And don't get me wrong, every capitalist country does this, in some form or another, not just the US, like what France and UK did to its ex-colonies. I spoke a lot about Germany and Italy, but those are far from being the only historical examples of when liberalism transforms itself into fascism. Being the most common example of this, the practice of fascism and atrocities towards outside the country, like what happened in Algeria, when the profits went down in Algeria due to several factors including the independence movement. The French liberal government started literally practicing Nazi tactics in Algeria, where the French government literally started using concentration camps and committing numerous atrocities against the Algerian population, all for the sake of making profits. The general French population didn't benefit from Algeria, but a few very wealthy individuals did, and it was from them that the French acted as they did. Just a reminder that we are talking about post-World War II period, and if you're interested in this topic, I highly recommend a book by Jean-Paul Sartre called Colonialism and Neo-colonialism. Fascist reactions are not an abnormality, they are the norm in capitalist society, a defense mechanism that gets into action every time the system feels in danger, even if you don't see it, which is the majority of the time. Despite the fact that in this video I mainly talk about the West, personal reasons, it is by far a phenomenon that it's only present in the West. One of the most prominent examples that impressed me the most was the Sangyong strikes, when in response to massive layouts, almost half of the workers were fired, and as a response to that, the workers went on strike, and the government used the police as an authoritarian force of oppression to defend the capitalists. Not only many of the protesters were beaten and imprisoned, also blacklisting from working for other companies. Plus, they were sued by the government to pay the damages caused to the company for the strikes. Examples like this are very common across Korea and Japan. Now, let's get back to 2022. We are living the post-COVID era, on the brink of one of the biggest economical crises that has been wrapping up since 2008, or more precisely, since the 70s of the last century, and the rise of the neoliberalism in the majority of Western countries. We have inflation growing to unprecedented levels, a massive increase in housing prices, fueled by the mass commodification of the houses by the big companies, taking the housing prices to an unsustainable level. We have the climate crisis, and we have many other problems, which brings the current generation to a level of uncertainty that has been only experienced on the last century. Due to this, we also start seeing a wave of civil unrest, also last time seen in the last century, with massive protests everywhere, like UK or railway strikes, which is the biggest in the last 40 years. And strikes like this are not unique to the UK, but to all Western world, from the return to the rise in unionization in the US, to massive strikes across all the EU, as many of you have experienced this summer if you use a plane or a train. As a consequence of the reinsurance of the working class solidarity and socialist values in society, we also have seen massive rise in fascism parties across the Western world, while simultaneously our government are using its apparatus fascist tactics against its own population, being this, of course, once again financed by the capitalists, just like they always used to do when the profits go down. At this point, it's undeniable that we are in a crisis. Maybe we are in the beginning of a crisis, but still we are in it. For the same reason, I truly believe that we are only experiencing the beginning in the rise of fascism, and things could get much worse. As Engels once said, history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. I don't know what's going to happen, and the reality is that nobody knows, but we should try to do as much as we can in order to make sure that things don't get to a sad point, and encourage our close ones to do the same. Take care of yourself, your community, and practice solidarity. So we finally came to the end of this video. It was a very interesting journey, very depressing to be honest, but I finally managed to do it. Thank you for watching. I don't know if somebody's still watching at this point, but if you like what you have seen, consider subscribing, and if you want to help me, consider becoming a Patreon to help me create these videos even faster. Yeah, I think that's all. Thank you for watching and take care.